Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, September 21st, 2022. And on this episode, I'm talking about this perpetual, basically, national state of emergency that we live under that always requires some additional power to deal with than authorized by the Constitution. And millions and millions and millions of people live in a state of fear and are willing to give up liberty for so-called security from the empire. Man, I don't know what else to add, so let's get to that. Before getting to all the interesting stuff, I've got some insight from the founders and old revolutionaries, John Dickinson, James Otis Jr. I'm going to talk about the National Emergencies Act. I've got an article or two from John Whitehead over at the Rutherford Institute, and a bunch more. I will link to all the stuff that I'm referencing over in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. We publish a blog post for each individual episode where you can find all the different platforms we're on, all the links that I'm mentioning, usually all the links that I'm mentioning in each episode, and even our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month, and no one makes it go that $2 of devalued fiat paper. No one makes that go further and standing against the people who are printing it and ruining its value in support of the Constitution and liberty than the TAC. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat while we allow people a minute or so more to get notifications to join us on the live stream. There's Kirk in South Carolina. Good to see you. Dixie in Alabama. Cheriton Farmer in Missouri, Tim Martin in Arizona, Tyler B., Clay Kent, Ozzy Crosby says, we're in trouble, no doubt about it. Lisa Believe, Brian in Georgia, Tom Norman in Wren, Ohio, Missouri Liberty Report, Cole Cochran, and everyone else. I appreciate you guys spending some time with me. Let's start out, first of all, with, if you've listened to this show for any amount of time on a regular basis, and no pressure on that, but you should, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. And we're on all your favorite podcast platforms. You can find them at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I got to do a little promo once in a while. You've probably heard me cite John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, written near the end of 1767 in response to the hated Townshend Acts. It's where we get the Latin phrase, or at least he got it from somewhere, but where I got the idea of the Latin phrase concordia res parve crescunt. It means small things grow great by concord. He was basically saying at the beginning of those letters, like, once you see a problem, don't just let it go. You got to take steps against it. And then when you take even a small step, you can build and build and build. And of course, the penman of the Revolution is what he was known as, John Dickinson. He was correct. And in the years to come, small things did grow great by concord. And the people, well, anyways. He gave this really great story in his 9th letter from a farmer in Pennsylvania, talking about giving government emergency powers. That's how we can put it today. He didn't use that term, but an emergency power just for this situation. And he said even in the one situation that ends your freedom right then and there. It's kind of a long passage, but let me read this because I think it's so important. He said, this is in his 9th letter. It'll be linked to in the show notes. Spain was once free. Their Cortes resembled our parliaments. No money could be raised on the subject without their consent. One of their kings, having received a grant from them to maintain a war against the Moors, desired that if the sum which they had given should not be sufficient, he might be allowed for that emergency only to raise more money without assembling the Cortes. TLDR. They had a war, and we know that the power of the state always increases in war. James Madison specifically said war is perhaps the greatest threat to the public liberty because it gives it armies, and from armies you get debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. No nation, according to James Madison, could preserve its freedom in a state of perpetual war. So Dickinson is giving us this story about what happened in Spain. I don't really know the history of Spain at all, so maybe they weren't free. I don't know, but in his view, he's saying they had freedom. And they couldn't raise money without consent of the representatives of the people, but there was this one emergency. They had this dangerous situation, and they had to break the rule for that, right? For that emergency only. He said the request was violently opposed by the best and wisest men in the assembly. We can't do this. We've got a process, and we know what happens when you allow people emergency powers. That's the mentality. Dickinson continues, it was, however, complied with by the votes of a majority. And this single concession, one single concession, was a precedent, and he all capped the precedent, was a precedent for other concessions of the like kind, until at last the Crown obtained a general power of raising money in cases of necessity. So it started out with the king couldn't get any additional money without approval from the representatives of the people. Then it was one emergency, and then it kept going more and more and more, small steps. But over time, eventually, it was whatever the king felt was necessary and proper for the king's power, right? From that period, Dickinson wrapped it up, the Cortes ceased to be useful. They're not even any use at that point because you've got one person making the decision, and the people ceased to be free. James Otis Jr. had his own version of this kind of a story. Not this one particular, but he recognized as a student of history, writing as Freeborn American in 1767, that a free government never degenerated into tyranny all at once. It is the work of years. So each precedent builds upon another and another and another. And the founders are very clear. Well, I'll get to that in a moment. Here from Cornell Law School, their Legal Information Institute, they have a page on emergency powers. And they started out very truthfully here. But of course, we know that most people educated in the government-approved law schools are horrible on the Constitution. They love expansive government power. And they start out with this. The Constitution does not expressly grant the president additional war powers or other powers in times of national emergency. That should be the end of the story because it does not grant the president, it doesn't grant anybody additional powers. I've read the Constitution. I've read it a bunch of times. Some people might think it's boring to read through, but every now and then you might want to start skimming or Command F or Control F, whatever you need to do, and look for the word emergency. It doesn't exist. There is no you can do more stuff if you determine that there's something bad happening. There are certain limits. And this is, well, they go off the rails in sentence 2. They say, however, many scholars think the framers implied these powers, even though no one ever discussed them. No one ever said, well, we're going to have these extra powers in the back that we're not going to tell anybody about, and they can do that. They felt that the framers implied these powers because the structural design of the executive branch enables it to act faster than the legislative branch. Now, James Wilson, who was one of the guys who was the supporter of the big government mentality of the time, he was a big government federalist, he specifically told us that the system will not hurry us into war. It is calculated to guard against it. Specifically. So they wanted to actually slow things down. They didn't want an executive that could quickly change things for the nation, for all the states, for the union of states in any type of situation of fear. Anyways, the founders intentionally did not include an emergency power blank check. You gotta follow the Constitution kind of thing unless stuff happens. They intentionally didn't do that. Here's how Samuel Adams described these types of things. In all free states, the Constitution is fixed. It doesn't have kind of an open-ended process where the government itself can say, well, now we need to do more things. It'll just be temporary, and we'll give that power back, which they never do anyways. For the founders, a government had to have these types of fixed, strict limits. Any wiggle room was considered arbitrary government, the beginning of tyranny. Arbitrary government was one of the grievances, maybe one of the most important ones, in the Declaration of Independence. It's one of the reasons they fought a long, bloody war to separate from the great empire of that time. I did an episode covering this. Arbitrary government, how the founders defined tyranny. So, anyways, we got this thing in 1976, the National Emergencies Act. It was passed after decades of never-ending emergency powers, going back to the FDR times. And of course, I mean, I don't think most of that was really gone if anything, the precedent is there. Any emergencies that they've closed, the precedent still exists. So all of a sudden you start hearing about when some new emergency comes up, or so-called emergency. James Madison, of course, warned us that the loss of liberty at home was to be charged against danger, real or pretended, from abroad, from outside. And Madison recognized that government, if they wanted to expand power, they would play upon the fear of the people and expand their power. And if they didn't have a real situation, they'd make it up. I mean, was he just a conspiracy theorist? I mean, he was a student of history. So there was decades of emergency powers that never were repealed. And so in 1976, they passed this thing to, quote, end all previous national emergencies and to formalize the emergency powers of the president. I don't think that's a constitutional thing at all. But anyways, back to Cornell. They say the act did not revoke the outstanding emergency declarations, but instituted an expiration date on existing declared emergencies, barring further action. So over time, they did go away. The 4 national emergencies that the act was meant to address were the 1933 banking crisis, back when they robbed people of the gold, for example, in which President Roosevelt renewed the National Emergency Declaration Act prohibiting the hoarding of gold. And I love how they use the term hoarding, because hoarding is considered as a negative, and so just the language here is manipulative. But I think you guys understand what we're getting at here, just getting through the dates. The 1950 Korea War communism scare. Again, a scare in which President Truman declared an emergency in Proclamation 2914. The 1970 postal workers strike. It was a national emergency, and Nixon threatened to get mail delivered with the National Guard. Wow. I didn't even know about that one until I was reading through this one. 1971 inflation emergency, and maybe we'll have the 2022 inflation emergency if they've got a so-called reduction act that's probably causing much more inflation. There again, Nixon declared an emergency via Proclamation 4074 and imposed a temporary surcharge on imports to strengthen the international economic position of the United States. He didn't want to keep any type of a sound money system, just added more taxes and costs to the people. But that's really important stuff. So supposedly they were dealing with those things. And we know, of course, as John Adams put it, writing in 1776, that fear is the foundation of most governments. I'm wearing the shirt. I think the only thing that he got wrong there was the word most. Because if you're worried about freedom and you need someone to protect people to make sure you got freedom, that is based on fear. Even if it's rational and you think as a minarchist type of mentality that it's okay, it's still based on fear. So fear is the foundation of government power. I did an episode talking about that FDR time. Back in 2020, April of 2020, 420, how the emergency of 1929 and its aftermath revolutionized America. So this stock market crash, it provides an excellent example of how an emergency or crisis can be used to revolutionize a society permanently and destroy liberty in the process. I think you guys should check that one out. It's really interesting, kind of more modern history than what I normally do, but it's an example of what we might be seeing play out again in front of our own very eyes today. Anyways, back to Cornell law. The Legal Information Institute, the 1976 Act also provide for a variety of termination methods. So the problem was supposedly there was no way to guarantee that these national emergencies would be terminated, and FDR could put one in and it would just stay there forever, or Nixon would put one in and would stay there forever, and there was no process. So all you needed was a process, and that would resolve the problem. Well, no, it didn't. It didn't resolve the problem because we're in the same situation, because people with power, they don't give it back. They will gladly renew. And so it included an automatic termination of a national emergency on its anniversary every year if the president does not act to renew it. So it's still in the hands of one person to determine if that one person is going to have additional authority for himself. And how does that play out? They keep renewing almost all of them. Rarely do they terminate them. For example, they do, but they always have a new one. There's always something else to explain why we need them, right? For example, the state of emergency declared in Proclamation 7463 in response to the September 11th terrorist attacks was due to terminate, finally, most recently in September of 2016. I'm not sure when this was published. However, the next president continued the state of emergency past that date by following the procedure. So now that there's a procedure, everything supposedly is going to be resolved, and it certainly was not. Here's how John Whitehead put it in a great article over at the Rutherford Institute, and I think you should read it in full. I'm just going to highlight this one piece here, but this is more about continuity of government plans for emergency powers, where, man, the shutdowns we experienced over the last 2 years are just scratching the surface of what they claim the power to do behind the scenes. And that's just the stuff that we're able to read about, not the secret national security kind of emergency powers that they've got planned behind the scenes. So I will link to that in the show notes, but here's how John puts it. The seeds of this present madness were sown almost 2 decades ago when George W. Bush stealthily issued 2 presidential directives that granted the president the power to unilaterally declare a national emergency. Now, I'm not certain of the history on that. Maybe this is specifically for continuity of government issues in context in the article. And we can see how these emergency powers go way, way, way back. And they are loosely, these national emergencies are loosely defined as, quote, any incident, regardless of location, that results in extraordinary levels of mass casualties, damage, or disruption, severely affecting the U.S. population, infrastructure, environment, economy, or government functions, basically anything. And in fact, if you think about it, most of the things that we face that are difficult today on infrastructure, environment, the economy, and government functions are problems of the government. So the real emergency is that we have too much government, but maybe I should do that in another episode. So the continuity of government plans that Whitehead talks about in this article, he's basically saying what we saw starting back in 9/11 and this mass police and surveillance state that we got out of that, and then what we got from the lockdown state of the last couple of years, the plans are far, far worse. Now, one thing we should be aware of is that none of this should be surprising. Of course, once a precedent is established, if John Dickinson understood this without the internet back in 1767, soon the first time you give them a little bit of wiggle room to do what they want for that emergency only, that establishes a precedent to build on and build on and build on, and then you are immediately lost of your freedom. You've immediately lost your freedom as soon as you give them the precedent. It's not when they actually act upon it and build upon it later. The real loss of freedom happens right at the beginning. And here's how John Adams put it in his Novanglis letters in 1775. The nature of encroachment upon the American Constitution is such as to grow every day more and more encroaching. Like a cancer, it eats faster and faster every hour. It's absolutely a cancer that is eating the Constitution and liberty and our livelihood and our futures alive. It is really destructive. Here, back to John Whitehead in another article that we republished over at TAC just a couple of weeks ago. He said, here's what we know. Given the rate at which government keeps devising new ways to establish itself as the solution to all of our worldly problems at taxpayer expense, and even if they didn't collect taxes, they still have that printing press. It's the hidden inflation tax. The more money that they print that they can spend, the less that we have purchasing power. So they're really destroying our futures, especially people. I can't imagine people who are on a fixed retirement getting really hammered by this inflation garbage that comes from the government. It's definitely a national emergency, and government needs to be shut down to really solve it. Or at least most of it. I would take 10% at this point, every small step. As John Dickinson told us, small steps grow great by concord. Maybe we'd take 1%. Anyways, I should read this over. I'm just kind of rambling off on tangents here. Here's what we know. Given the rate at which the government keeps devising new ways to establish itself as the solution to all of our worldly problems at taxpayer expense, each subsequent crisis ushers in even larger expansions of government power and less individual liberty. This is the slippery slope to outright tyranny. Now, the founders and the old revolutionaries considered despotism, tyrannical government, to be arbitrary government. Now, if you happen to live under an arbitrary government that can make up the rules on a whim and they do the right thing and they don't violate people's liberty in every way possible, then you're pretty lucky. But eventually someone's going to come in and have that same power and use it in ways to just absolutely crush individual liberties. And honestly, even though you and I are being able to have this kind of communication right now, if you think about it, most of what we do today, when it's not really freedom. We're basically just lucky we happen to have permission from government to get away with doing things. At any time, they claim the power to shut down the internet. They claim the power to take your right to keep and bear arms, what you grow in your backyard, the size of light bulbs, toilets, when you have to fight a war for them for many people and die in support of their efforts, in support of the empire. I mean, it is almost endless. And the amount of money that they steal from people to claim all these powers is insane. Here's how Brutus put it in his great anti-federalist papers in his fourth paper. Oh, it's right in front of me on the screen. It's his fourth. He said, power lodged in the hands of rulers to be used at discretion is almost always exercised to the oppression of the people. Man, am I being more radical than Brutus by saying just remove the word almost? I guess he's actually correct. And my instinct is to say, well, it always is. I would say it always is eventually. Now, some people who get power to do things at their discretion don't crush your liberty, but eventually someone else will have that power and use it in the wrong way. And I think that is the great warning that we should have for everyone around us, because so many people are willing to allow or turn a blind eye to additional powers in the government as long as it's their team doing it, without even thinking beyond 1 year or 1 month or 4 years or 6 years, whatever it may be, that sooner or later your enemy is going to have that same power, and they certainly are not going to use it in the way that your team did. So power lodged in the hands of rulers to be used at discretion is almost always exercised to the oppression of the people, and in the long run, always used that way. Here's how John Whitehead put it again. He said, you see, once the government acquires and uses authoritarian powers to spy on its citizens, to carry out surveillance, to transform its police forces into extensions of the military, and also its federal agencies, right, to seize taxpayer funds, to wage endless wars, to censor and silence dissidents, to identify potential troublemakers, to detain without due process, it does not voluntarily relinquish them. Once government gets power, it never, ever hands it back without a lot of spirited work by the people. He said the lesson for the ages is this: once any government, not some, not most, once any government is allowed to overreach and expand its powers, it's almost impossible to put the genie back in the bottle. It's certainly very difficult. George Mason warned us of the same thing. He said those who have power in their hands will not give it up while they can retain it. They will not. He doesn't say they will sometimes give it back. He says they just won't do it. This is, again, a recognition of human nature. People are power hungry. Well, people who are power hungry, once they have it and they're there, they are never returning that to the people. On the contrary, George Mason said, we know they will always, when they can, rather increase it. So somebody will say, Bolden, well, this dude didn't increase the power too much. Mind you, there's the caveat. When they can, they can't always get away with it. Even today, when we're surrounded, literally, completely surrounded in the grassroots by our neighbors, our friends many times, by people who absolutely loathe liberty, sometimes they just can't get away with anything and everything. And maybe sometimes the partisanship actually works to our, well, no, I'm not going to get into that, to our advantage, because at least there's always some level of opposition, even though they switch what they're supporting and opposing based on which team is in charge. Anyways, over at the Brennan Center, this is they have an interesting guide to emergency powers and their use. There are 136 statutory powers that may become available to the president upon declaration of a national emergency. It was last updated. It was first published in December of 2018, last updated in June of 2022. You can read through this whole thing. There's just an amazing amount of stuff regarding terrorism and public health and all kinds of stuff. And we've seen some of it play out. I think it could get much worse depending on who is wielding that power. I will link to that in the show notes. It is an excellent resource to actually read through. And if anybody's really interested in kind of condensing this and explaining it as an article, I'd love to hear about it or see what you got. Team at 10thamendmentcenter.com would be a good place to send some ideas. And then over at Wikipedia, they actually have a list of national emergencies, and they describe it as a situation in which a government is empowered to perform actions not normally permitted. I mean, do you see anything from the founders that say, well, the government has to be on these fixed limits unless something comes up? There's no such thing in the Constitution. The founding generation never would have approved such a government. They literally fought and bled against that kind of government. There's no way that that's what it was. But unfortunately, we, the people, have been living in fear for so long that we've tolerated this kind of thing and in many situations beg for it. Here they write that as of April 2022, 79 emergencies have been declared, 37 have expired, and 42 are currently in effect, each having been renewed annually by the president, whoever that president may be. John Whitehead puts it this way: we've been losing our freedoms so incrementally, just like what James Otis Jr. said in 1767. You don't go from a state of freedom, of any level of freedom, to total tyranny in one fell swoop. It's about building upon precedent and precedent and precedent. So John notes this as well. We've been losing our freedom so incrementally for so long, sold to us in the name of national security and global peace, maintained by way of martial law disguised as law and order, and enforced by a standing army of militarized police and a political elite determined to maintain their powers at all costs, that it's hard to pinpoint exactly when it all started going downhill, but we, the people, are paying the price for it now. Man, I should have had a link to this other episode that I did sometime last year. When did things go off the rails? I take the Thomas Jefferson view on these things. And he said in 1791, to take a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution, I am paraphrasing this, is to take a boundless field of power. So I make the case that things went off the rails, things started going downhill in 1791, if not earlier. 1791, when the First National Bank was signed into law with the support of Alexander Hamilton, signed by George Washington, over the opposition of his fellow Virginians Edmund Randolph, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson. So things have been starting to get incrementally worse ever since the beginning, unfortunately. And John says, unless something changes in the way we deal with these ongoing, egregious abuses of power, the predators of the police state will continue to wreak havoc on our freedoms, our communities, and our lives. How do you change things? Well, John Adams, again, in that Novangelis letter in 1775, he said, nip the shoots of arbitrary power in the bud. He was talking about a Latin phrase which James Otis Jr. had used some years earlier, obsta principiis. This was a political maxim to the founding generation, to the old revolutionaries. Nip it in the bud. He said, it is the only maxim which can ever preserve the liberties of any people. So you can't just let things get out of control and then just hope that the people who've got the power are going to just turn it back. And John Dickinson, in his Fabius number 4 letter, I think, in support of ratification, he said, it's ultimately up to the supreme sovereignty of the people to keep things in check. If you rely on government to limit its own power, you shouldn't be surprised when that power grows and grows and grows, whether there's an emergency or not. He says it is their duty, again, the people, it is their duty to watch and their right to take care that the Constitution be preserved, or in the Roman phrase on perilous occasions, to provide that the Republic receive no damage. Man, nasty stuff that we're facing, and it's certainly, I like to find silver linings. All the work that we do, State of the Nullification Movement report that we're updating for 2022, Mike Meharry and I are doing a lot of back and forth on that right now. Well, mostly back to me, not a lot of forth to Mike lately. He's been doing the bulk of the work on this. But we find silver linings, efforts on a state, local, and individual level to resist, reject, and nullify things. But ultimately, we're really still facing the largest government in history, the largest empire in history, and it keeps growing. We have to keep building this foundation Follow John Dickinson's advice. Small things grow great by Concord. Follow Thomas Jefferson's advice in his letter to his friend, the Reverend Charles Clay, in 1790, when he said, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. We aren't expected, and now in another letter he said, we aren't expected to go from despotism to liberty in a feather bed. It's going to take a lot of work to get things in the right way. And I honestly am more of a cynic. I don't expect, and I'm never going to promise any of you, that we can have a state of liberty in our lifetime. But I still believe it is my duty. I believe it's all of our duty to stand up for what's right, no matter what the odds are. If we happen to get it, then great. But I don't want to give anyone any false hope or false expectations. That's absurd, because what we're facing today is far worse than what most people actually even think about in their day-to-day lives. But it's still our duty to start setting the foundation for future generations. Because as Samuel Adams put it, if we turn a blind eye, if we suffer tamely a lawless attack upon our liberty, we encourage it and we involve others in our doom. Millions yet unborn are going to pay the price for us not taking a stand. Anyways, let me take a look and see if there's any comments or questions I can quickly get to in the live chat and see how bad things are. Well, protesting is laughed at by tyrants. No doubt about it. Protesting is, protesting has a place because it can rally people to the cause. But what it really takes to keep tyrants in check, as Lysander Spooner told us in his great Defense for Fugitive Slaves, A Defense for Fugitive Slaves, his paper of 1850, which basically kept the lineage of the resistance to the Stamp Act, the founding generation. How do you deal with government that goes beyond its limits? You resist it. Because as long as people continue to comply, Dickinson put it this way in response to the Stamp Act, if you comply with the act, you rivet perpetual chains around your unhappy country. You establish the detestable precedent which the people who have been, basically begging for have been, you're just giving it to them voluntarily. So the solution to government overreach is not to wait for government to stop doing government stuff. It's to resist, reject, refuse to comply, and nullify at every turn. We got a lot of work. It's going to be a lot of education and a lot of courage over time. I don't expect it to happen overnight, but certainly we've got to build that foundation for the future. Anyways, I will look a little bit further in the live chat later on today, and then also in the archives. Please continue leaving comments. That does help trigger the algorithms of these platforms and tells them to show us to more people. Don't forget our membership program. You can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We could certainly use your help today. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. No pressure though, no pressure, just a little bit. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And don't forget, if you can't do that, you can also leave reviews over at Apple Podcasts. Continue leaving comments, subscribe, get notifications, all those things to help that algorithm triggering that we love to see more of. Again, I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. I'm not excited about the bad news, but certainly we have to get this information out to people. People have to be aware of what we're facing and how bad things are, and that they can get much worse until we turn things around ourselves. We're not going to fix it by waiting on some political savior to ride in on a white horse in Washington, D.C., whether it's the courts or Congress or the executive branch or the state capitals or any of it. It's ultimately up to the people to do the right thing. Anyways, thank you again for being here with me today. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you learned something. Hope it made you think. And I'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.